All right, so you've given us just a mountain of stuff to wade through here, and it all seems to be circling around the same question that I think every parent has, which is, how do we raise kids who are not only smart, but happy?
Yeah.
Like, those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive.
No.
Right. And it's really tough out there because there's just so much advice coming from every direction, some of it contradictory.
Right.
And so one of the things that really kind of stood out to us from the stack you gave us was John Medina's Brain Rules for Baby.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about Medina's book is that he comes at this from a very strong scientific background.
Yeah.
He's a developmental molecular biologist, but he's also pulling from behavioral psychology. And he really wants to get down to the nitty-gritty of how the brain develops and how that relates to how children learn and grow.
Yeah, he even says in the book that he wrote this because parents kept coming to him with these very practical questions, like what do I do? How do I handle this situation? Every day kind of stuff. And really looking for answers that are grounded in something other than just somebody's opinion.
Right.
Right. And so we really want to kind of, in this deep dive, focus on what the science says.
Yeah.
Like, what's the really trustworthy stuff that we can rely on to make decisions about how we're going to raise our kids?
Yeah. So why don't we start right at the beginning with pregnancy?
Okay.
There's this idea out there that you need to be, stimulating your baby's brain in utero.
Yeah.
Like playing Mozart or, even trying to teach them Morse code.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
The poor little one bombarded already.
Yeah. Medina really dispels that myth.
Okay.
He says that in the first half of pregnancy, really the best thing you can do for your baby's neural development is to kind of just leave them alone.
Just let them do their thing.
Yeah. Let those foundational structures develop without a lot of interference.
Right. Okay. So first half of pregnancy kind of hands off, but then it gets really interesting because he brings up something that's a little counterintuitive. Maybe the potential benefits of morning sickness.
Really?
Yeah. So there's this study, and it's not been consistently replicated, so that's really important to note. But this one study suggested a link between significant nausea and vomiting in pregnancy and higher IQ scores in childhood.
Wow.
And what was really interesting was that a high proportion of those kids who had those higher IQ scores were later identified as gifted.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Isn't that wild? And the idea behind this is that the hormones involved might, in a way, act like a neural fertilizer.
Interesting.
It's a really curious finding, and it kind of shows how these things that we might perceive as negative during pregnancy can sometimes have these really unexpected links to development.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that the body's signals during pregnancy are complex.
Very complex.
And we don't always intuitively understand them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But of course, more research is needed to really confirm that. But what is more firmly established is the very early development of the senses in the womb.
Right.
So touch, for example, becomes active incredibly early, like around 4 weeks.
4 weeks? That's amazing.
I know, before many people even know that they're pregnant.
Right.
And then hearing develops a little bit later towards the end of the second trimester. And it's amazing to think that even in that protected environment, babies are already starting to show preferences. Like, there was that really cool study where newborns recognized and preferred their mother's voice reading The Cat in the Hat if they'd been exposed to it in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Isn't it? It's like they're already learning and tuning in, and they also can become familiar with other sounds. They hear regularly, like snippets of TV jingles that their mothers were exposed to a lot during pregnancy.
Right.
And taste and smell also start to develop. And those are influenced by what the mother is eating. Yeah. It's really remarkable. And Medina brings in this really helpful concept here. He calls it the Goldilocks principle.
I like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Just right. Yeah. It's not about overwhelming the baby with constant stimulation or completely shielding them, but finding that just right amount of all the necessary elements for healthy development.
Right.
And that idea of just right, I think, is something that we see coming back again and again, not only in prenatal development, but also in things like screen time later on.
Exactly.
And how much stimulation we provide. It's about finding that balance.
And that principle of just right extends to how we fuel the developing brain during pregnancy as well.
Yeah.
Nutrition is absolutely key. And again, it's about finding that sweet spot, that just right amount.
Yeah.
He talks about, those very strange pregnancy cravings.
Oh, yeah.
And even pica, which is that craving for non-food items.
Yeah, that can get really weird.
It can get really weird, yeah.
But on a more serious note, he emphasizes the potential benefits of omega-3 fatty acids.
Right, those healthy fats that you find in fish.
Exactly. And the Harvard study he talks about suggests that mothers who consumed more fish in their second trimester, at least around 12 ounces per week, tended to have babies who scored better on cognitive tests in their first 6 months.
Oh.
So there does seem to be a link there between getting the right nutrients and the appropriate amounts and brain development. But that just right principle also applies to something that's a little less tangible but equally important, maternal stress.
Yeah. We all know that pregnancy can be a stressful time.
Of course.
But Medina really emphasizes that too much maternal stress can have a negative impact on the developing brain.
Yeah, and this is where the role of cortisol comes in.
Right. Cortisol is that key stress hormone.
Exactly. And when a mother experiences prolonged or very high levels of stress, excess cortisol can actually cross the placenta and affect the baby's developing stress response system.
Wow.
And what that means is that the baby might have more difficulty regulating their own stress hormones later in life.
So that can actually have long-term effects.
Potentially, yeah. And he talks about the Quebec ice storm study, which is this really powerful illustration of those long-term effects. It showed that pretty significant stress during pregnancy can have lasting impacts on children's development. And it's kind of a sobering thought. It really highlights how interconnected the mother and baby are.
It really is.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? He also talks about the benefits of exercise during pregnancy.
Absolutely. Moderate exercise is beneficial for both the mother and the baby. It can help to buffer against stress. And there's even some evidence suggesting a potential link to smarter babies and an easier labor.
Okay, so moderate exercise.
The key is moderate.
Right, because strenuous exercise can actually lead to overheating in the womb and restrict oxygen flow.
Right.
Which is obviously not what we want.
Not good.
And he mentions that swimming is often a really good option, especially as you get further along in the pregnancy.
Makes sense.
So it sounds like pregnancy is all about finding that equilibrium, right? Allowing that natural development to unfold, providing the right nourishment in the right amounts, managing stress, and engaging in appropriate physical activity.
Yeah.
And then, of course, comes the monumental shift, the arrival of the baby,
right?
And the realities of new parenthood.
Yes. And Medina doesn't sugarcoat this at all.
No, he does not.
He acknowledges how overwhelming and relentless those first few months can be.
Oh, my goodness.
The sleep deprivation.
Legendary.
The potential for social isolation. Your whole world shrinks to feeding schedules and diapers.
Yeah, you don't see anybody.
And then there's the massive increase in workload.
Yeah.
And the impact that all of that can have on a marriage.
On a relationship, yeah. And that's something that I think a lot of new parents maybe don't fully anticipate. And he specifically addresses marital conflict and those common pressure points. Things like lack of sleep, that feeling of being cut off from your previous social life, and very often an unequal division of labor when it comes to childcare. And then, of course, the very real risk of postpartum depression.
It's a lot.
It is. It's a lot. And it's a time when even the strongest relationships can be really tested.
And what's important to understand is that couples who go into this with a really strong foundation in their relationship and who have talked about these things and maybe even planned for the arrival of children, they tend to weather the storm a little bit better.
Right.
Even something as basic as both partners being on the same page about wanting to have children in the first place.
Right.
That can make a big difference.
Yeah. And this dynamic between the parents isn't just about their own happiness and well-being. It really has a profound impact on the baby.
That's right.
Medina emphasizes that a baby's primary drive is for safety and secure attachment, and they are constantly monitoring their caregivers.
Yeah, they're little sponges.
They are. They're taking it all in.
Absolutely.
And if their needs for that safety and that consistent loving attachment aren't met, it can unfortunately lead to long-term emotional difficulties. And he talks about the situation in the Romanian orphanages,
right,
which is really heartbreaking. And he talks about problems with either excessively high or low levels of cortisol.
Wow.
And the impacts that can have on a child's developing emotional regulation.
So these were extreme examples, but they really illustrate the importance of that secure attachment.
Absolutely. That secure base is crucial. And when there's frequent conflict and tension in the home, the baby's developing brain can be negatively affected by that, by the increased levels of stress hormones in their environment. And Medina talked about potential links to, difficulties with emotional regulation later in life and increased risk of antisocial behaviors, even potentially lower IQ scores and other health problems down the line.
Right. And, it's a lot to think about, but he does offer a very important message of hope here.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that in very young infants, the brain is incredibly plastic.
Adaptable.
And these negative effects can actually be reversed if the baby is placed in a nurturing and empathetic environment.
Right. So creating that stable and loving environment, not just for the baby, but also within the parental relationship.
Absolutely.
Is paramount.
It's key.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a little bit and move beyond, the purely biological aspects of development and talk about how we can actively nurture a child's intelligence. And Medina starts by challenging a very common assumption, doesn't he?
He does. He says, we often think that the brain's primary function is learning.
Yeah.
But he suggests that its main priority is actually survival.
Okay.
And that learning is just a really powerful tool that serves that goal.
Right. It's how we figure out how to survive.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, understanding dangers and how to navigate the world was crucial for our survival as a species.
Right. We had to figure out how not to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger.
Yeah.
Okay, so given that survival-first framework, what are the key ingredients that Medina identifies for nurturing a smart baby?
He outlines 4 key areas.
Okay.
The first is breastfeeding.
Okay.
Which he presents as not just a source of vital nutrition, but also a potential brain booster.
Right. And he does acknowledge the sometimes uncomfortable social realities around breastfeeding.
He does.
Which is something I think a lot of mothers can relate to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The second key ingredient is something that might seem really simple, but is incredibly powerful, just talking to your baby.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the number of words, it's also about the richness of the language that you use, the variety, and the positive feedback that you give.
Right.
And, he mentions a sort of gold standard of around 2,100 words per hour.
That's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words.
But, he talks about studies that show that children whose parents talk to them more using a wider vocabulary and offering that positive reinforcement had significantly better language skills and even higher IQ scores by the time they were 3. So it really is about that interaction, that back and forth, not just having the TV on in the background.
Exactly. It's that genuine human interaction that's so important.
Right. Okay, so breastfeeding, talking to your baby. What's number 3?
Number 3 is guided play.
Okay.
And this is where Medina really emphasizes the importance of open-ended imaginative play in developing what we call executive function.
Okay, now remind me, what is executive function again?
So executive function is essentially the brain's management system.
Okay.
It's that set of skills that allows us to plan, control our impulses, hold information in mind, and work with it and stay focused.
So it's like the CEO of the brain.
Exactly. It's the CEO. And those skills are absolutely fundamental for success in life.
Yeah.
Maybe even more so than raw intelligence.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. And how does play help develop those executive function skills?
Well, Medina uses this really great analogy. He calls it the behavioral equivalent of Miracle-Gro.
I love that.
So instead of a toy that only has one specific function, open-ended play involves things like blocks, dress-up clothes, or even just everyday objects that a child can use in countless different ways.
Yeah.
And it allows them to take the lead, solve problems, and really exercise those executive function muscles.
So we're not talking about, those electronic toys that have, just one very specific thing that they do. We're talking about things that allow for creativity and imagination.
Exactly. And he even talks about mature dramatic play and programs like Tools of the Mind that actively cultivate these skills through play.
Okay, so it's about creating opportunities for kids to really use their imaginations.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got breastfeeding, talking to your baby, guided play. What's the 4th key ingredient?
The 4th one might be a little bit surprising to some people.
Okay.
It's praising effort, not IQ.
Oh, interesting. So not just telling kids how smart they are.
Right. Medina explains that constantly telling children that they're smart can actually backfire.
Oh, how so?
Oh, it can make them less willing to take on challenges.
Because they're afraid of failing.
Exactly. They don't want to risk looking like they're not smart anymore.
Right.
So instead, he advocates for praising their effort, their persistence, their hard work.
So focusing on the process.
Exactly. And that helps to instill what's known as a growth mindset.
Okay, a growth mindset.
Which is the understanding that abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work.
I like that.
He uses a great example of a little boy named Ethan, who was very bright, but really struggled when he was faced with challenges because he'd always been told he was just naturally smart.
Right. So he never really learned how to work hard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that made him think that effort meant he wasn't actually intelligent.
Wow. So it's really about shifting the focus from innate ability to the the effort and the work that you put in. Okay, so we've got these 4 key ingredients for nurturing intelligence: breastfeeding, talking to your baby-guided play, and praising effort. Now, let's move on to a topic that I think is on every parent's mind these days: screen time.
Oh, yes. The screen time dilemma. It's everywhere.
It is, and Medina addresses the elephant in the room. You know, the sheer amount of time that kids are spending in front of screens these days: TV, computers, tablets, phones, and the numbers are pretty startling.
They are. He highlights the potential negative consequences of excessive TV watching, particularly for children under the age of 2.
Okay.
Studies have linked it to language delays,
Really?
increased likelihood of bullying behavior, and decreased attention spans.
Wow.
And he even cites one study that found that for each hour of TV watched daily by children under 3, the probability of them having attention problems at age 7 increased by 10%.
10% per hour.
Per hour.
That's a lot.
It's a significant increase.
Yeah.
And, there are those Brady Baby DVDs that were so popular.
Oh, yeah, Baby Einstein.
Exactly. And he debunks that idea that those are beneficial.
Okay.
He says there's really no evidence to support that.
Yeah, and I remember there was a study on the Baby Einstein videos that actually showed that they didn't lead to any measurable cognitive gains in infants.
And he tells this really interesting anecdote about a slumber party with a group of 9-year-old girls who were all more engrossed in texting each other than in actually interacting face-to-face.
Oh, wow.
And it raises this concern about, are we losing some of those essential social skills, those abilities to read and interpret nonverbal cues because we're spending so much time communicating through screens?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important skill to develop, and it only comes through real-world interaction. So it sounds like it's not just about the content that kids are consuming on screens.
Right.
It's also about what they're missing out on.
Exactly.
When they're glued to a screen,
Yeah.
Those opportunities for face-to-face interaction and imaginative play.
Right.
That's really important. All right. So now let's talk about understanding and fostering creativity. Yeah.
And Medina broadens the definition of intelligence beyond just IQ, that number that you get on a test.
He does. He links it to that inherent exploratory behavior.
Right, like the baby's fascination with the microphone.
Exactly.
He sees that natural curiosity, that willingness to experiment as really foundational for innovation and future success.
Right, and he brings back the idea of executive function here.
Okay.
And he emphasizes that these skills, things like planning, problem solving, working memory, the ability to stay focused, are actually stronger predictors of academic success than IQ alone.
Really?
He even mentions the famous marshmallow experiment.
Oh, yeah, where they put the marshmallow in front of the kids and tell them not to eat it.
Exactly. And they found this really striking difference in SAT scores decades later between the kids who could delay gratification and those who couldn't.
Wow. So being able to control your impulses and delay gratification.
Really important.
That's a really powerful predictor of success later in life.
It is. And the good news is that executive function, unlike IQ, can be trained and strengthened through things like those open-ended play activities that we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Okay, so when it comes to creativity itself, Medina outlines some core components. What are those?
So he talks about the ability to perceive new relationships between things, to generate novel ideas, to evoke emotions through your creations, to produce a tangible result, and even to take risks and step outside of conventional thinking.
Okay, so it's not just about being artistic. It's really about this broader way of thinking.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he talks about the role of association cortices in the brain.
Now, what are those again?
So think of these as the brain connection hubs.
Okay.
They're the areas that help us link seemingly unrelated information together.
Ah, so that's where those aha moments come from.
Exactly.
That would be it.
And he also introduces the concept of functional impulsivity,
Okay.
which is basically a willingness to take calculated risks and explore new avenues.
Interesting. So it's not just about being impulsive?
No, it's about having that drive to explore.
Okay.
And then he talks about the Torrance tests of creative thinking.
Yeah, I've heard of those.
And they're surprisingly accurate at predicting an individual's future creative output.
It's amazing how they can assess something as, seemingly abstract as creativity through these tests.
It is fascinating.
It really, okay, so another really important aspect of raising well-rounded kids, both smart and happy, is their social and emotional development.
Absolutely.
And Medina dedicates a good chunk of the book to this.
He does, and he really stresses the importance of face-to-face interaction for developing the ability to accurately read nonverbal cues.
Right, those facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, all that stuff.
Exactly. And he even references Paul Ekman's work on facial expressions and the universality of emotions.
Yeah.
And he talks about the critical need for human time.
Human time.
Human time to really hone these skills.
Okay.
Because, the human brain is inherently social.
Right. We're wired for connection. Exactly. Our need for community is deeply rooted in our evolutionary history.
Right. We needed each other to survive.
Exactly.
Okay. So then he introduces this idea of brain rules for happy baby.
Yeah.
And he touches on some key concepts like the fact that babies are born with their own unique temperaments.
Right.
And the fleeting nature of emotions in young children.
Yeah.
You know how they're kind of like Post-it notes, they come and go really quickly.
They do.
And the critical role of empathy in building friendships.
Right.
And the importance of community for both parents and children.
Yeah, a supportive network is so important.
Absolutely. And how simply labeling emotions can be so effective in helping kids calm down when they're having big feelings.
Just giving a name to that emotion.
Exactly.
Can really help.
Yeah. So he really delves into the genetic basis of temperament. He talks about Jerome Kagan's research on high versus low reactivity in infants.
Right.
But he wisely emphasizes that these are just initial tendencies, not destinies.
It's not set in stone. Right. The environment that a child is raised in plays a huge role in shaping how those temperamental traits ultimately manifest.
Absolutely.
And he even talks about the potential influence of what are sometimes called resiliency genes.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the fundamental concept of attachment.
That deep and reciprocal emotional bond between a baby and their caregiver.
Yeah, it's so essential for healthy social and emotional development.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's move on to a topic that's really central to raising, good human beings, the development of morality.
Okay.
And Medina poses this really fundamental question. Are babies born with a sense of right and wrong?
Are they inherently moral?
Yeah, and his answer might surprise some people.
What does he say?
He says yes.
Really?
He argues that babies do possess some innate moral sensibilities.
Interesting.
But of course, it's not that simple. He goes on to explain how moral reasoning develops and matures over time.
Right.
And he talks about this complex interplay between our logical thinking and our emotions.
Yeah, we don't make moral decisions in a vacuum.
We don't.
Our feelings are involved.
They are. And he even references that classic philosophical debate between Hume and Kant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the role of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in the brain.
And what is that exactly?
So that's the region that's involved in linking emotions to decision-making.
Okay.
And he highlights the case of Elliot, who, after damage to that specific brain region, retained his intellectual abilities but lost the capacity to make sound moral judgments.
Wow. So even though he could think clearly, he couldn't make good moral decisions.
Right. It was like he lost his moral compass.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it really underscores the critical role that emotions play in this process.
So it's not just about knowing right from wrong.
No.
It's about feeling it.
Exactly. Okay, so then Medina outlines 3 key aspects that he says are crucial for raising a moral child.
Okay, what are those?
So the first is establishing clear and consistent rules along with clear rewards for following those rules.
Okay.
And he uses this helpful acronym, CAP, which stands for Clarity, Application, and Promptness.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so clarity, making sure the rules are easy to understand.
Right.
Application, consistently enforcing those rules. And promptness, delivering rewards or consequences in a timely manner.
So the punishment or reward needs to happen pretty quickly after the behavior.
Exactly. That's really important for learning.
Makes sense.
Okay, so clear and consistent rules and rewards. What's number 2?
Number 2 is the importance of swift punishment when rules are broken.
Okay.
He uses the example of a pigeon learning to associate a behavior with a reward or punishment.
Okay.
To illustrate how quickly learning occurs when the consequence follows the action very closely in time.
So basically, you have to make the connection between the behavior and the consequence very clear.
Exactly.
Okay, so swift punishment. And then number 3, which I think is maybe the most important one, is explaining the reasons behind the rules.
So not just saying because I said so.
Exactly. He calls this inductive discipline.
Okay.
And he talks about the power of providing children with reasons for why certain rules are in place.
Because it helps them understand.
Exactly. It helps them internalize those moral principles.
Right.
And he contrasts this with just punishing without explanation.
Which doesn't really teach them anything.
Exactly. It might get them to comply in the moment,
Right.
but it doesn't help them develop that deeper understanding.
So it sounds like inductive discipline is really about fostering that moral understanding.
Exactly.
Not just blind obedience.
Exactly. And he does note, though, that a child's temperament can influence how effective this approach is.
Right. Different kids respond to things differently.
They do. And he also addresses a very controversial topic, spanking.
Okay, this is a tough one.
He presents the APA's findings against it.
The American Psychological Association.
Yes, and he talks about research that links spanking to increase aggression in children.
Right.
And he mentions the argument that spanking might primarily trigger what's called deferred imitation.
Deferred imitation.
Which is basically just mimicking the behavior later.
So they're not actually learning the moral lesson.
Right. They're just learning to hit when they're angry.
Right, because that's what they've seen.
Exactly. Okay, so it sounds like, a consistent, warm, communicative approach where rules are clearly explained and fairly enforced is really the most effective way to help kids develop a strong moral compass.
That makes sense.
All right, so now let's turn our attention to something that I think is on every parent's mind.
What's that?
How do we cultivate happiness in our children?
Yeah, how do we raise happy kids?
And Medina really delves into this. He talks about the recipe for a happy child.
Interesting.
And he emphasizes that engaging with and understanding children's emotional lives is absolutely central to their future happiness.
So it's not just about, providing for their physical needs.
No.
It's about understanding their emotional world.
Exactly. And he introduces Diana Baumrein's 4 parenting styles.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those.
And he highlights the effectiveness of what's called the authoritative style.
Authoritative?
Which is characterized by being both demanding,
okay,
meaning having expectations,
Right.
and warm and responsive.
Okay, so having clear boundaries, but also being loving and supportive.
Exactly.
So it's that balance again
Should've been
between structure and nurture.
Yes, and he connects this to John Gottman's concept of meta-emotion philosophy.
Meta-emotion philosophy. Now, that's a mouthful.
It is, but it's basically just referring to how parents themselves feel about emotions
Okay.
and how they tend to react to their own and their children's feelings.
So it's about being aware of your own emotional landscape.
Exactly, and how that influences your parenting style.
Right.
And then Medina outlines what he calls the 6 spices of happy parenting.
The 6 spices.
Yeah, this is good stuff.
Yeah.
So the first one is adopting that authoritative style that we just talked about.
Okay, demanding but warm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second is being comfortable with your own emotions.
Right. So modeling healthy emotional expression.
Exactly. The third is actively tracking and being aware of your child's emotions.
Okay, so paying attention to their emotional cues.
Exactly. The fourth is verbalizing emotions.
So putting words to those feelings.
Exactly. The fifth is running towards intense emotions with empathy.
Okay, not trying to shut them down or dismiss them.
Meeting them where they are.
Right.
And then, of course, the 6th spice is empathy itself.
Makes sense.
Right. So he uses Edward Tronick's famous still face experiment as a really powerful example of how important it is to be tuned in to a child's emotional cues and to respond to them.
Yeah, that experiment is always a little bit unsettling to watch.
It's powerful, though, and he highlights how verbalizing emotion.
Just helping kids label what they're feeling.
Exactly. That can be a really key step in their developing the ability to self-soothe and manage those emotions.
So it's like giving them the tools to regulate their own emotions.
Exactly. And he even mentions a really interesting connection between musical training.
Music.
Yeah, and an enhanced ability to perceive the emotional nuances in speech.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Isn't it? And that idea of running towards intense emotions with empathy, that's so important.
It is. It's about being there for them in those difficult moments.
Exactly. Not trying to fix it or make it go away, but just being present with them.
And validating their feelings.
Exactly. And Gottman's research found that even around 30% of empathetic interactions can lead to a happy child.
Wow. So it doesn't have to be perfect.
No, it doesn't. It's about those small, consistent efforts.
That's encouraged.
It is. Okay. So let's talk about the development of something that's really closely intertwined with both morality and happiness. Theory of mind.
Theory of mind.
Yes, that ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and intentions.
Right, that they're separate from us.
Exactly. And Medina explores its development by looking at how lying evolves in children.
Lying.
Yeah. And it's interesting how the ability to deceive actually indicates a growing understanding of other people's mental states.
So they have to understand that someone else might believe something that's not true.
Exactly.
in order to lie effectively.
Right, and he uses Ernest Hemingway's famous 6-word story.
Oh, yeah, I love this one.
For sale, baby shoes never used.
So powerful.
Isn't it? And it's such a concise illustration of how we use theory of mind to infer someone else's internal state and construct a narrative.
Right. We immediately understand the heartbreak behind those words.
Yeah, and he points out that this ability develops gradually over time, and it's shaped by social experiences and interactions.
Right. So the more opportunities kids have to interact with others,
The better they'll get at understanding those different perspectives.
exactly. And he reminds us of Albert Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment,
Oh, yeah.
which showed that children learn behaviors simply by observing them.
Right, even if those observed behaviors are punished.
Exactly. It highlights the power of modeling.
Yeah, so we have to be really mindful of the behaviors that we're modeling for our kids because
Okay.
they're watching.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me and helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.